In 1717, a ship carrying more pirate treasure than any vessel in the Western Hemisphere was caught in a storm off the coast of Cape Cod, Massachusetts. She was a three-masted galley, fast, heavily armed, and loaded down with the plunder of over 50 captured ships: gold coins, silver bars, jewelry, ivory, indigo, weapons, and enough wealth to make every man on board rich for the rest of his life. The storm hit just after midnight. Within hours, the ship was upside down on a sandbar, her hull split open, her cannons dragging her to the ocean floor. Of the 146 men aboard, 143 drowned. The treasure, estimated at over $4.5 million in today's money, scattered across the seabed and vanished beneath the sand. For the next 267 years, nobody could find her. Then, in 1984, a diver from Cape Cod pulled a cannon out of the water and changed everything we thought we knew about pirates, about colonial engineering, and about one of the most fascinating ships ever built. This is the story of the Whydah, the only authenticated pirate shipwreck ever recovered, and the engineering behind why she sank in minutes. Now, to understand the Whydah, you need to understand what she was before she became a pirate ship. Because the Whydah was never designed to be a weapon of war. She was designed to carry human beings across the Atlantic Ocean in chains. If you trace your finger across a map of the Atlantic world in the early 1700s, you'll find a triangle, not drawn on any chart, but burned into the economics of 3 continents. The first leg runs from Europe down to the west coast of Africa. Ships carried manufactured goods, textiles, iron bars, guns, and alcohol. They sailed south past the Canary Islands, past the Cape Verde archipelago, and anchored along the coast of what is now Ghana, Togo, Benin, and Nigeria. This stretch of coastline was known by European traders as the Slave Coast. The second leg of the triangle, the Middle Passage, is the one that haunts history. Ships loaded with enslaved Africans crossed the Atlantic to the Caribbean and the American colonies. The journey took anywhere from 6 to 12 weeks, depending on weather and currents. Conditions below deck were so brutal that mortality rates regularly exceeded 20%. Some voyages lost a third of their human cargo before ever reaching land. The third leg brought colonial commodities back to Europe, where the profits funded the next voyage. And the triangle repeated. The Whydah was built specifically for this trade. She was constructed in London in 1715, commissioned by a consortium of slave traders who needed a ship that could do something most vessels of the era could not. She needed to be fast enough to outrun pirates in the open Atlantic, large enough to carry hundreds of enslaved people in her hold, and sturdy enough to survive 3 consecutive ocean crossings without returning to port for major repairs. The shipwrights who built her solved these problems with a design that was, by the standards of the early 18th century, genuinely remarkable. The Whydah was what naval architects call a galley, not the oared galleys of the ancient Mediterranean. Before we go any further, I need to stop for a second, because what I've been showing you in these videos only scratches the surface. And I realized at some point that the full picture, the actual pirate code, word for word, the real punishment records, the exact treasure division shares, the ports that secretly funded them, it doesn't fit in a video. I put it all into one document, the Black Flag Codex. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let's keep going. By the 1700s, the term referred to a specific hull shape, long and narrow relative to beam width, with a shallow draft that let the ship sit higher in the water. This made her faster than the wide, boxy merchant frigates that dominated Atlantic trade. Where a typical merchantman might manage 5 or 6 knots in favorable wind, the Whydah could push 8 or 9. In a world where speed was the difference between profit and piracy, between life and death, those extra knots mattered enormously. Her hull was approximately 100 feet long and measured roughly 25 feet across the beam. That ratio, about 4-to-1, gave her a sleek profile that cut through the water with less resistance than ships with wider hulls. She displaced around 300 tons, fully loaded, which put her in the middleweight class of Atlantic vessels. Not as large as a Royal Navy warship, but considerably bigger than the sloops and brigantines that most pirates sailed. The Whydah carried 3 masts. The foremast and mainmast were square-rigged, meaning they carried large rectangular sails that excelled at catching wind from behind or at broad angles. The mizzenmast, the rearmost mast, was rigged with a lateen sail, a triangular configuration borrowed from Mediterranean and Arab sailing traditions. This combination gave the Whydah flexibility that pure square riggers lacked. She could run with the trade winds on long Atlantic passages, then use her lateen rig to maneuver in tighter coastal waters or work her way upwind when necessary. Below the waterline, her hull was sheathed in sacrificial planking or copper sheeting to protect against the teredo worm, a wood-boring organism that could eat through an unprotected hull in months in tropical waters. Standard practice for ships working the African and Caribbean routes, but it added weight and cost. Her armament, as originally built for the slave trade, was modest. She carried 10 cannons, enough to discourage small-time pirates and coastal raiders, but not enough to stand and fight against a warship or a well-armed privateer. This was deliberate. Every cannon took up space and added weight. Space and weight that could otherwise carry more enslaved people or more cargo on the return voyage. The Whydah's owners were businessmen. They calculated in bodies per square foot, not broadside firepower. The ship's hold was divided into compartments designed to maximize the number of human beings who could be packed into the available space. Platforms were built between decks, creating shelves where enslaved people were forced to lie side by side, often with less than 3 feet of vertical clearance. Ventilation was minimal. Sanitation was non-existent. The engineering of the hold was precise, efficient, and profoundly cruel. Every measurement served a single purpose: profit. The Whydah completed her maiden voyage in late 1716. She sailed from London to the coast of West Africa, loaded her human cargo, crossed the Atlantic to the Caribbean, sold the survivors, and loaded up with sugar, indigo, and other colonial goods for the return trip to England. She never made it home, because somewhere in the Windward Passage, the narrow strait between Cuba and Hispaniola, the Whydah sailed directly into the path of a man named Samuel Bellamy. Bellamy is one of the most fascinating figures in the entire history of piracy, and the fact that hardly anyone outside of pirate historians knows his name is one of history's stranger oversights. He was born in Devon, England, around 1689. His early life is mostly lost to history, but what survives suggests he came from a working-class family with no particular wealth or connections. He went to sea as a teenager, which was common for boys from coastal towns with limited options on land. By his mid-20s, Bellamy had ended up in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. The story, and this part has been debated by historians for 3 centuries, is that he fell in love with a young woman named Maria Hallett. Her family, depending on which version you believe, either rejected him for being too poor or simply didn't approve of a rootless English sailor courting their daughter. Either way, Bellamy needed money, fast. He heard rumors about a Spanish treasure fleet that had wrecked off the coast of Florida in 1715. Dozens of ships carrying gold and silver from the New World back to Spain had been caught in a hurricane. Much of the treasure was still sitting on the ocean floor. Bellamy decided to go find it. He sailed south to Florida, met up with a crew of fortune hunters, and spent weeks diving on the wrecks. But the Spanish had already recovered most of the accessible treasure. The easy money was gone. This is where Bellamy made the decision that would define his life and his legend. If he couldn't salvage Spanish gold from the ocean floor, he'd take it from Spanish ships on the ocean surface. He turned pirate. And unlike many pirates of the era who were essentially violent opportunists, Bellamy developed something resembling a philosophy. He called himself the Robin Hood of the sea. In one famous speech to a captured merchant captain, Bellamy said the only difference between himself and the colonial governors was that he robbed under the honest flag of his own intentions, while they robbed under the cover of law. Whether this was genuine belief or branding is impossible to know, but the effect was real. Sailors on captured ships frequently volunteered to join Bellamy's crew. His fleet grew quickly. Within about a year of turning pirate, Bellamy was commanding multiple vessels and had captured dozens of ships. But he didn't have the Whydah yet. That changed in February 1717. Bellamy's small fleet spotted the Whydah in the Windward Passage. She was on her return voyage from Jamaica, her hold packed with cargo: sugar, indigo, quinine, gold, silver, and ivory. The total value of what she was carrying was staggering. The chase lasted 3 days. The Whydah was fast, faster than almost anything else on the water. But Bellamy had 2 ships, and he used them to cut off escape routes, herding the Whydah like wolves cornering a deer. Every time the Whydah's captain, a man named Lawrence Prince, changed course, Bellamy anticipated the move and repositioned. On the 3rd day, Bellamy got close enough to fire. He put a few shots across the Whydah's bow, a signal that said, "Surrender or we will sink you." Captain Prince looked at his 10 cannons, looked at Bellamy's fleet, and made the only rational decision available to him. He surrendered. Bellamy didn't just take the Whydah's cargo. He took the ship itself. And this is where the engineering story gets interesting, because Bellamy immediately recognized what the Whydah could become. She was fast, well-built, and her hull was strong enough to carry far more cannon than her original owners had bothered to install. The same structural integrity that allowed her to carry hundreds of people in her hold could also support the weight of heavy guns on her deck. Bellamy's crew went to work refitting her. They added cannons, lots of them. The Whydah went from 10 guns to 28. That's almost triple her original armament. They mounted guns along both broadsides, giving the ship the ability to deliver devastating volleys from either direction. They also installed swivel guns along the rails, small anti-personnel weapons that could be aimed quickly during boarding actions. They stripped out the slave compartments in the hold, opening up space for stores, ammunition, and the growing pile of treasure from captured ships. They reinforced the gun decks to handle the recoil of the larger cannons. They adjusted the rigging to compensate for the additional topside weight. But here's the thing about adding all that firepower. Every cannon weighed between 1,000 and 3,000 pounds, depending on size and caliber. 28 cannons meant the Whydah was now carrying somewhere between 30 and 50 additional tons of iron on her upper decks that her original designers never accounted for. The ship's center of gravity shifted upward, significantly. In naval architecture, this is one of the most dangerous things you can do to a vessel. A ship's stability depends on the relationship between her center of gravity, which is the average point where all her weight is concentrated, and her center of buoyancy, which is the point around which the water pushes upward against the hull. When the center of gravity is low, the ship is stable. She rolls with the waves and rights herself. When the center of gravity is high, the ship becomes tender. She rolls more easily, recovers more slowly, and in extreme conditions, she can capsize. Bellamy's modifications raised the Whydah's center of gravity. The additional cannons, the swivel guns, the extra crew, the accumulated treasure stored in chests and barrels. All of it pushed the ship's balance point higher than the London shipwrights had ever intended. She was still seaworthy. She still sailed beautifully in moderate conditions. In fair weather with following winds, the Whydah was one of the most formidable vessels in the Atlantic, but her margin of safety in extreme weather had been reduced. The buffer between stable and unstable had gotten thinner, and Bellamy was about to sail her directly into the worst storm the New England coast had seen in years. After capturing the Whydah, Bellamy went on a rampage through the Caribbean and up the Atlantic coast. In the space of about 2 months, he captured over 50 ships. 50! The man was operating at a pace that would be remarkable even by the standards of the Golden Age of Piracy. He took everything: gold, silver, rum, weapons, supplies, cargo, and willing crew members. The Whydah's hold filled up. Her decks were crowded with loot and men. By April 1717, Bellamy had a crew of about 146 and a ship that was sitting lower in the water than she'd ever sat before. He turned north. The reason is almost certainly Maria Hallett. Bellamy was heading back to Cape Cod, back to the woman he'd left behind when he went searching for Spanish treasure. He was coming home rich, coming home a captain, coming home as everything he hadn't been when her family turned him away. On the evening of the 26th of April, 1717, the Whydah and her companion ship, the Marianne, were sailing along the outer shore of Cape Cod. The weather was deteriorating. Fog had rolled in earlier that day, and the wind was picking up from the east, an ominous direction that suggested a nor'easter was building offshore. Bellamy tried to navigate around the tip of Cape Cod and into the relative shelter of Cape Cod Bay. But the fog was thick, the coastline was treacherous, and the charts of the era were notoriously inaccurate in this part of the world. Sandbars shifted with every major storm. What was deep water last year might be a ship-killing shoal this year. The storm hit with full force after midnight. Wind speeds exceeded 70 miles per hour. Rain came sideways. Waves built to 30 feet and higher. Visibility dropped to nothing. And the Whydah, heavy with treasure and guns, with her center of gravity pushed dangerously high by months of modifications and accumulation, began to struggle. The sequence of events that followed unfolded with terrifying speed. The wind drove the Whydah toward shore. In the darkness, in the rain, in waves that were taller than her masts were high, Bellamy's helmsman couldn't see the sandbars until it was too late. The ship struck a bar approximately 1,500 feet from shore. The impact was violent enough to stop a 300-ton vessel dead in the water. But the striking wasn't what killed the Whydah. What killed her was what happened next. The waves continued to push the ship sideways. With her keel stuck on the sandbar, the Whydah couldn't turn her bow into the waves, which is the standard survival maneuver for any sailing vessel in heavy weather. She was pinned broadside to the surf. The waves rolled her. Those 28 cannons, each weighing 1,000 pounds or more, were mounted on carriages that allowed them to slide in and out of gun ports for loading and firing. In normal conditions, the carriages were lashed down when the guns weren't in use. But in a storm this violent, with the ship heeling at extreme angles, the lashings failed. The cannons broke free. Stop for a second. What you just heard about the pirate code is the part that rewrites everything you thought you knew. But it only lands when you see the actual shares, the exact fractions written into the Articles of Agreement, the punishments, the port records, the names of the men who funded them from government offices. It's all in the Black Flag Codex, linked in the description. 5 seconds. Grab it now, because what comes next builds directly on it. Link is below. QR code is on your screen. Imagine 3,000 pounds of iron sliding across a tilting wooden deck. Now imagine 28 of them doing it simultaneously. Every time the Whydah rolled to starboard, tons of loose iron slammed against the starboard bulkhead. Every time she rolled to port, the same mass crashed back the other direction. This is called a cargo shift, and it's one of the most feared events in maritime history. Once heavy objects break free inside a ship, they become battering rams that destroy the vessel from the inside out. The shifting weight amplifies the roll, which loosens more cargo, which shifts more weight, which amplifies the roll further. It's a death spiral. The Whydah's hull couldn't take it. The internal structure, her frames, her knees, her deck beams, started to fracture under the repeated impacts of loose cannons and shifting treasure. Water poured in through the gaps. The masts, already stressed by the hurricane-force wind, snapped. Without her rigging, the Whydah lost any remaining ability to maneuver or stabilize herself. She capsized. The ship went over, keel up, in the surf zone. Her hull broke apart as she rolled. Cannons, treasure, and men spilled into the churning water. The Atlantic off Cape Cod in late April sits at roughly 45 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, a person loses motor function within 15 minutes and consciousness within 30. Most of Bellamy's crew never had that long. They were dragged under by the waves, battered by debris, or pinned beneath the wreckage of the ship they'd been sleeping on minutes earlier. Samuel Bellamy died that night. He was 28 years old. He had been the wealthiest pirate in the Western Hemisphere, the self-proclaimed Robin Hood of the sea, and the captain of the most formidable ship between Boston and Barbados. He drowned within sight of the shore where the woman he loved was waiting. Of 146 men aboard the Whydah, only 2 survived: Thomas Davis and John Julian. Davis was a Welsh carpenter who had been forced into Bellamy's crew after his ship was captured. He would later use this fact as his defense at trial. Julian was a Mosquito Indian from Central America who had served as the Whydah's pilot. His fate after the wreck is one of history's quieter tragedies. He was sold into slavery. A pirate who sailed under a captain who gave speeches about freedom was, in the end, sold as property. The 2 survivors were brought before a court in Boston. Cotton Mather, the Puritan minister who had presided over the Salem witch trials, attended the proceedings and reportedly used the case as a sermon illustration about the wages of sin. 6 other pirates from Bellamy's fleet, captured from the Mary Ann, were tried alongside them. Davis was acquitted because he could prove he'd been forced to join. Julian's story disappears from the records. Of the remaining 6, all were convicted. 2 were hanged. The Whydah's wreck settled into the sand about 1,500 feet from shore, in roughly 15 to 30 feet of water. The Cape Cod coastline is one of the most dynamic shorelines on the East Coast. Sand moves constantly. Bars build up, erode, rebuild in new configurations. The wreck was buried within months, then uncovered, then buried again, over and over for 2.5 centuries. Local legends kept the story alive. Cape Cod fishermen and beachcombers occasionally found old coins or fragments of timber after big storms. Everyone knew there was a pirate ship out there somewhere. Finding it was another matter entirely. In the 1920s and 1930s, several attempts were made to locate the wreck using the technology of the era, which amounted to dragging hooks along the bottom and hoping to snag something. None succeeded. Then came Barry Clifford. Clifford grew up on Cape Cod, hearing stories about the Whydah from his uncle. As an adult, he became obsessed with finding the wreck. He spent years researching colonial records, court transcripts, contemporary accounts of the storm, and early maps of the coastline. He cross-referenced everything to narrow down the search area. In 1982, he began a systematic underwater search using magnetometers, instruments that detect anomalies in the Earth's magnetic field caused by large concentrations of iron, like, say, 28 cannons sitting on the ocean floor. In 1984, Clifford's team found the first artifacts: coins, cannonballs, fragments of the ship's structure. Then they found the ship's bell, cast in bronze, encrusted with centuries of marine growth, but with 2 words still legible: the Whydah. This was the moment that changed underwater archaeology forever. Before the Whydah, no pirate shipwreck had ever been positively identified. The romantic mythology of piracy, the treasure maps, the Jolly Roger, the buried gold, was essentially unverifiable. It was folklore. The Whydah's bell made it real. Over the following decades, Clifford's team recovered more than 200,000 artifacts from the wreck site. The collection includes gold dust, gold jewelry, gold coins from multiple nations, silver coins, navigational instruments, weaponry, personal effects of the crew, and fragments of the ship's hull that reveal details about her construction that no surviving blueprint or plan ever recorded. The coins alone tell an extraordinary story. They come from England, Spain, Portugal, France, Africa, and the Caribbean. Many are clipped or shaved, common practices in an era when a coin's value was determined by its metal content. Some bear mint marks, tracing them to colonial mints in Mexico and Peru. A few are so rare that numismatists had only seen them in engravings before the Whydah recovery. Among the personal effects, archaeologists found a silk stocking, a cufflink, a pistol with a carved ivory handle, and a small gold ring. Whether any of these belonged to Bellamy himself is unknown, but the ring in particular has fueled speculation. Was it a gift for Maria Hallett? Was he carrying it back to Cape Cod as a promise? The firearms recovered from the wreck reveal the state of naval weapon technology in the early 18th century. The Whydah carried a mix of English, French, Dutch, and Spanish guns collected from dozens of captured ships. Each piece was functional, maintained, and loaded. Bellamy's crew didn't hoard weapons as trophies, they used them. Perhaps the most significant finding was the hull itself. Fragments of the Whydah's structure allowed marine archaeologists to study 18th century shipbuilding techniques previously known only from written descriptions. The framing patterns, the joint techniques, the wood species used, all of it provided data that no document could match. The timber analysis showed that the Whydah was built from English oak for her frames and elm for her keel, with tropical hardwoods in structural elements probably added during her time in the Caribbean. Bellamy's crew didn't just sail the ship, they repaired and modified her continuously. Now, why did she sink so fast? The engineering answer involves multiple compounding factors, and understanding them reveals something important about the limits of wooden ship design in the age of sail. The Whydah was designed with a specific load profile in mind. Her structural members, her frames, her planking, her deck beams were dimensioned to handle the stresses of her intended cargo and armament. 10 cannons, 300 tons displacement, a specific weight distribution between hold, deck, and rigging. Bellamy changed all of that. He nearly tripled the armament, added crew, and filled the hold with dense, heavy treasure. The ship was overloaded, not catastrophically so in calm weather, but the safety margins that the London shipwrights had built into her design were consumed by the modifications. When the storm hit, those missing margins became fatal. The raised center of gravity made her more susceptible to rolling. The overloaded hull sat deeper in the water, which meant waves broke over her decks more easily. The additional topside weight put greater stress on the masts and rigging during the extreme wind gusts, and when she grounded on the sandbar, the structural loads exceeded anything the hull was designed to withstand. The cargo shift was the final catastrophe. Once the cannons broke free, the outcome was inevitable. No wooden ship of that era could survive having 50-plus tons of iron slamming back and forth across her gun decks. The internal structure failed, the hull opened up, and the Atlantic poured in. From the moment the Whydah hit the sandbar to the moment she capsized, the entire sequence probably took less than an hour. Some estimates put it at 30 minutes or less. For a ship that had spent 2 years crossing oceans and outrunning warships, the end came with brutal speed. There's a lesson in the Whydah's story that extends beyond piracy and shipwrecks. It's a lesson about the difference between design limits and operating conditions. The ship was brilliantly engineered for what she was built to do, but she was modified, loaded, and sailed beyond the parameters her builders intended. The modifications that made her the most feared pirate ship in the Atlantic, the extra guns, the extra crew, the mountain of treasure, were the same modifications that killed her. Every engineering system has a safety margin, a buffer between normal operating conditions and catastrophic failure. The more you push a system beyond its design envelope, the thinner that buffer gets. The Whydah's margin was consumed gradually, one cannon at a time, one chest of gold at a time, one captured crew member at a time. In fair weather, it didn't matter. The ship performed beautifully. But engineering margins don't exist for fair weather. They exist for the worst day. And on the night of the 26th of April, 1717, the Whydah met hers. Today, the Whydah's artifacts are housed in a museum in West Yarmouth, Massachusetts. The Whydah Pirate Museum displays thousands of recovered items and tells the story of Bellamy, his crew, and the ship that carried them. It's the largest collection of pirate artifacts in the world, and it exists because one diver from Cape Cod refused to give up on a story his uncle told him when he was a kid. Barry Clifford's work on the Whydah site continues. New artifacts are still being recovered, and new techniques in marine archaeology continue to reveal details about the ship and her crew. In 2018, forensic scientists used DNA analysis on a leg bone recovered from the wreck to identify one of the crew members as a young man of West African descent. His name is unknown. His story is unknown, but his remains, analyzed 300 years after his death, confirmed something historians had long suspected. Bellamy's crew was one of the most racially diverse groups operating in the Atlantic world in the early 18th century. Free black men, escaped enslaved men, indigenous Americans, Europeans from half a dozen countries. The Whydah's crew was, in its own violent and chaotic way, more integrated than any colonial institution of its time. That fact doesn't make Bellamy a hero. Pirates murdered people. They terrorized merchant sailors. They disrupted trade routes that colonial economies depended on. Bellamy gave eloquent speeches about freedom and equality, but he also took what he wanted at gunpoint and made his fortune on the suffering of others. The Whydah herself is a monument to that contradiction. A ship built to carry enslaved people in chains, captured by a man who claimed to fight against oppression, loaded with treasure stolen from other ships, and sunk by the same ocean she'd crossed dozens of times before. She was brilliantly built. She was brilliantly sailed. She was brilliantly armed. And on one terrible night off the coast of Cape Cod, none of that mattered. The ocean doesn't care about your engineering. It doesn't care about your treasure or your speeches or your love story. It just finds the weakness you didn't account for, and it pushes until something breaks. For the Whydah, that weakness was 30 feet below the waterline, where a sandbar waited in the dark, and 50 feet above, where 28 cannons started to slide.